All right. Well, welcome everyone to a brand new book study. This is The Practice of the Presence of God. It's Brother Lawrence. And it's been years since we went through this book. I think this book is going to be a great follow-on to Falling Upward that we just spent the last year doing. I don't believe this book will take us nearly that long because it is so much shorter. And in truth, this really isn't a book at all. It's a compilation. And as we read through the introduction, the translator is going to talk more about that. So we'll kind of let him talk about what this book really is comprised of, but it is a collection of writings mostly about Brother Lawrence and a few of his own writings, but he never sat down and actually wrote a book. So we're going to be looking into the mind, the heart, and the life of a 17th century French monk. And so we'll be kind of going back in time a little bit to a completely different world. I chose this particular edition of the book that you all have because it looked like a good translation from the French, first of all. And second of all, it had a foreword by Henry Nouwen, who's one of my heroes. If you don't know about Henry Nouwen, you should get to know him. We did one of his books at a book study before, The Way of the Heart. And so we'll read his foreword because he brings out a few aspects. We're going to read part of the introduction, the part that really tells us more about Brother Lawrence as a man and a little bit of his history as much as we can piece together. And then also more about the book and what the book, the parts of the book have to offer. So we'll do that, and then we'll get into the actual text, the conversations, and then the letters, and we'll go from there.
You want to record, Dave?
I'm sorry?
Do you want to record?
I have been recording all along.
Okay.
Dave, I can't get on again.
Okay, well,
can't see
you'll just have to do the best you can, Linda, for now. Okay, dear?
Yeah,
We can
just
see you,
listen.
Linda.
We can see you. You just listen, and that'll be fine. I wrote a couple of pages. Actually, I wrote a whole chapter that had to do with Brother Lawrence, but I want to read you a couple of pages from my book because it kind of gives us an overview of what he's about and also some of the key phrases. Just want us to start to dial in and kind of get more and more familiar with who it is we're dealing with, because he's really an interesting character. And so let's start there. I'm going to put this on, share the screen. So you won't need your books for this part. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to read from here. And this is just by way of introduction, just by way of getting more of a view of who Brother Lawrence is. This starts with a quote from Brother Lawrence. Men invent means of coming at God's love. They learn rules and set up devices to remind them of that love. And it seems like a world of trouble to bring oneself into the consciousness of God's presence. Yet it might be so simple. Is it not quicker and easier just to do our common business wholly for the love of him? So this is hallmark Brother Lawrence. Instead of inventing all of these different ways of coming to God, these formal rituals and everything else that we do, we can just do what we do all day long. But if we do it with the conscious contact of God, it becomes a sacred act. And so this is really where he's coming from. In 17th century France, a young soldier fighting the 30 Years' War stood staring at a barren tree in the dead of winter. Stripped of leaves and flowers and fruit, it looked as lifeless as the armored figure before it. Arthritic sticks reaching senselessly into a cold sky. But it was at this moment that the fact of God first flashed in upon that soldier's soul as he realized that what only appeared dead was full of the presence of patient life, just waiting for the abundance of spring, that God promised presence, nowhere to be seen on a gray battlefield, still flowed vibrantly just beneath the surface of gnarled bark and distressed metal, awaiting only the slightest suggestion or invitation to burst outward into extravagant life and color. A few years later, the young soldier traded armor for the habit of a Carmelite monastery and took the name Lawrence of the Resurrection. A poor man with no formal education, Brother Lawrence was assigned to the kitchen, the room furthest from the chapel and spiritual center of the priory, the place where the cooking and cleaning and endless tedious tasks would drive anyone's sense of God's presence right into the ground. Yet it was there in his kitchen, as on a winter battlefield, that Lawrence realized how the presence of patient life flowed just as swiftly among his pots and pans as anywhere else in his little world. He writes, "The time of business does not with me differ from the time of prayer. And in the noise and clatter of my kitchen, while several persons are at the same time calling for different things, I possess God in as great tranquility as if I were upon my knees at the Blessed Sacrament. Lord of all pots and pans and things, make me a saint by getting meals and washing up the plates." Lawrence began to actually resent the formal times of prayer and worship because they took him away from the place where he served and connected with his brothers at the most fundamental level, the place where he could lose himself in his work and the presence of God he felt so thickly. "I have quitted all forms of devotion and set prayers, but those to which my state obliges me." He was quoted as saying, "It was a great delusion to think that the times of prayer ought to differ from other times, that when the appointed times of prayer were past, he found no difference because he still continued with God, praising and blessing him with all his might, so that he passed his life in continual joy." Lawrence spent nearly every moment of the rest of his life within the walls of his priory, working ceaselessly at his cooking and cleaning until old age forced him to mend shoes instead. We ought not to be weary of doing little things for the love of God, who regards not the greatness of the work, but the love with which it is performed. Nor is it needful that we should have great things to do. We can do little things for God. I turn the cake that is frying on the pan for love of him. It is enough for me to pick up but a straw from the ground for the love of God. His entire life was lived in obscurity and poverty. He never taught or traveled or wrote anything down other than a few letters to those who recognized in him the presence of someone who had learned to be truly present to God. Yet those letters and conversations recorded by others were bound into a little book, The Practice of the Presence of God, now a spiritual classic read by millions to this day. As we run in all directions at once, building cathedrals and empires for God, Brother Lawrence, whom we would never have given a second glance amid the grease and fires of his kitchen, quietly carries on, simply living kingdom instead of trying to build it, by being fully present to everyone and everything around him, no matter how seemingly insignificant or distasteful. He found the presence of God everywhere and anywhere he was. Our sanctification does not depend upon our changing our works, but upon our doing that for God's sake, which we commonly do for our own. There is not in the world a kind of life more sweet and delightful than that of a continual walk with God. Those only can comprehend it who practice and experience it. Brother Lawrence left a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to the realization that we enter the presence of God in no other way than by simply becoming present ourselves to everything and everyone around us. There's never any other way. Meditation, prayer, rituals and liturgies, musical worship, prayer beads, mantras, even yoga and other physical regimens are all techniques designed to quiet the conscious mind, that part of us that talks to us, that thinks about our thoughts, the voice in our minds that takes us up and out of the present moment and into the past or the future or the abstract. Quieting that voice is like setting the sun of our consciousness so the stars can come out against a dark sky, so we can finally see the presence everywhere around us. But techniques are just that, techniques and strategies to be used at specific times and places. What about all those moments in between? This is the genius of Brother Lawrence's breadcrumbs, that there is never a moment we need to be outside or unaware of the presence of God, that we can enter God's presence at will, that anytime, any place, we can see the Shekinah, God's tangible presence for the Hebrews, the pillar of fire by night and of cloud by day. that we can get to the point where the strategies we used to employ, the specific times of prayer and worship, become themselves the distractions, the breaks between living our lives as the uninterrupted presence and experience of God. When we turn off the cell phone and really enter into a conversation with a friend, when we push away from our work and look into our child's eyes, or see the eyes of a coworker and really see them, hear them, help them, when we pull off the road on the way home to watch the last rays of the sun disappear over the horizon, drop our briefcase or purse at the door and take the nearest face in our hands and kiss it. When we picture the people who will benefit from whatever work we do, and then do that work better, the best we can, with their faces to guide us. When we engage everything and everyone as if God were intimately present, we are finally beginning to know the truth that will make us free. Because the truth is, God is, and God always was, and God always will be present as we can stand him to be. Here's a few of the sayings of Brother Lawrence, and just a little smattering before we actually get into it. Nor is it needful that we should have great things to do. We can do little things for God. I turn the cake that is frying on the pan for love of him, and that done, if there is nothing else to call me, I prostrate myself in worship before him, who has given me grace to work. Afterwards, I rise happier than a king. It is enough for me to pick up but a straw from the ground for the love of God. And again, men invent means and methods of coming at God's love. They learn rules and set up devices to remind them of that love. And it seems like a world of trouble to bring oneself into the consciousness of God's presence, yet it might be so simple. Is it not quicker and easier just to do our common business wholly for the love of him? And began to live as if there were no one save God and me in the world. As often as I could, I placed myself as a worshiper before him, fixing my mind upon his holy presence, recalling it when I found it wandering from him. This proved to be an exercise frequently painful, yet I persisted through all difficulties. If we renounce ourselves, we'll know unspeakable joy. Always turn to Jesus Christ, asking him for his grace that makes everything easy. Neither finesse nor learning is required to approach God. Only a heart resolved to devote itself exclusively to him, loving him only. Ground yourself in God's presence by continually conversing with him. Nourish your soul by focusing your mind on God's glory. Accept the joy that comes from spending time with him. Renew your faith. It's terrible that we have so little. Give yourself completely to God. Abandon yourself to him. Find joy in doing his will in all circumstances. Suffering and joy are synonymous to someone yielded to God. We must be faithful in times of aridity when God is testing our love for him. And then you have a few of the spiritual maxims and some more from the letters, but that's enough for now. I just wanted to give you a taste and give you a sense of what Lawrence is really all about. All right. Obviously, I've been doing all the talking so far and all the reading. Any reactions to anything that you've heard so far? Any questions that you want to ask?
I'm just thinking of that suffering and joy is synonymous, that last line you just read there. Can you say some more about that?
Give yourself completely to God, abandon yourself to him, find joy in doing his will in all circumstances. Suffering and joy are synonymous to someone yielded to God. We must be faithful in times of aridity when God is testing our love for him. Yeah. See, to Brother Lawrence, he got to the point where the circumstances didn't matter. It didn't matter whether he was in chapel. It didn't matter whether he was in his kitchen. It didn't matter if he was tasked to go into town to buy supplies for the abbey. You know, it didn't matter. He died of pleurisy as he was nearing 80 years old. It didn't matter to him whether he was in pain and he was on his deathbed or if he was anyplace else. to him, he says, suffering and joy are synonymous to someone yielded to God. God's presence was what changed everything. And in presence to God, everything else was basically the same to him. That joy superseded anything else he was experiencing. He went so far as to say that if he found himself in hell, that the presence of his God would turn it into a paradise. So if you just ponder that for a second, first of all, he believed that God was everywhere, that there was no place that God wasn't. So even if he found himself in hell, God would still be present. And his presence and awareness of God's presence would turn it into a paradise. So for him, the circumstances don't matter. The details don't matter. Only God matters. Only the presence of God matters. So how does that set with you, William?
I love it. Mm.
I mean, wouldn't that be something if we could say with the same kind of conviction that our circumstances don't matter,
Mm.
I mean, obviously we've talked about this before, that if we're looking for happiness, contentment, fulfillment, we're not going to find it in our circumstances. We're going to find it coming from within. Jesus is always talking about the kingdom coming from within. You're not going to find it out there by observation. And we just spent a year going through a book that was telling us that the first half of life is looking outside for happiness and fulfillment and identity, in the accomplishments and in the building that we do and in relationships and roles that we play. But in the second half of life, when we bring it all together, we're realizing that all of that comes from within. Anything that is lasting, anything that really is speaking to true human purpose comes from within and comes from God's presence. So this is the same statement there being made, Suffering and joy are synonymous to someone yielded to God. The circumstances take back seat to the actual experience of our lives. Does that even sound realistic to you all?
I think it takes a very special human to get to that point. And I think of Mother Teresa also.
Mm-hmm.
It's going beyond the self. But I think the majority of us, me, I don't know if I can get there. Like I love my pistachio ice cream. I mean, right? I mean, that's heaven. That's a piece of heaven. But it takes a very saintly, mystical person to get to that point. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Pope Francis and Mother Teresa, those people, you see.
Well, actually, Ellen, you're making a point that Brother Lawrence himself is going to make later on. That not everybody can attain to the same level of pure presence that he got to, but that there is efficacy in trying. There is advantage in just working on it, just practicing the presence, because we will get closer if we practice. I suppose that, and I made notes when we get to that point that we'll read later. I suppose there are some people who are more, either by nature or nurture, more conducive to this kind of complete effacement, this kind of complete loss of self in the face of God's presence, the way Brother Lawrence was. He was a very poor man. He was an uneducated man. He was a simple man. He was called gross in nature, but great in grace. And so maybe he was born in a certain way, that he had a certain spirit that allowed him to do this. But still, he suffered and worked really hard for years before he started to get what he's talking about here to us as well. So I guess we'll never know until we try, how far we can get along this path. But what he's saying is that it helps just to try, no matter how far you do get. But yeah, I suppose those of us here, especially in the West, comparatively speaking, we have a lot. You know, we have a lot of material goods, we have a lot of education, we have a lot of everything. And as Jesus said, it's going to be harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom than for the camel to go through the eye of the needle. It's that idea that the more you have, the harder it is for us to lose ourselves and to lose and let all of that go. So, you know, there's something to be said for that. And not everybody is going to experience things in exactly the same way, of course, that Brother Lawrence did. But if we can learn from him and use his tools and techniques and his way, we can, who knows how far we can get. But to be able to leave our circumstances behind, to be able to stop trying to, you know, take our fulfillment and our sense of contentment and happiness out of our circumstances and more find it within ourselves, that's a freedom that Jesus is talking about, certainly.
One of the things I really, that jumped off the page that you were reading, Dave, is in line, I mean, just right down the line with this book of recovery on page 164. It says, abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you'll surely meet us, at some of us, as you trudge the road of happy destiny. Then it goes on to say, may God bless you and keep you until then.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. It's just right there.
Mm-hmm.
Very much on the same lines, John.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. But how hard is it to do that, right?
It's in the practice.
And Brother Lawrence is right up front with this. He says this is the hardest thing that you'll ever do. It's the hardest thing that he ever did, you know, even coming from his station in life, which was very menial, but it was so difficult. But he kept at it, you know, for 50 years in his monastery. And the first 10 were very difficult, but the last 40, he lived in a continual joy that was so apparent to other people that they were the ones, you know, who saved his letters. They were the ones who recorded the conversations. They were the ones who gave the eulogy at his funeral, which have all been collected in various editions of the book that's attributed to Brother Lawrence.
Wow.
And so he was someone that you couldn't mistake for having an essence to him, having a sense of presence to him that was remarkable.
You really established a picture in my mind, a mental picture for me about Brother Lawrence when you brought him up in Sunday service, and really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to this study about him and with his life.
Great. Any other thoughts? Questions?
I'm really resonating with this idea of, you know, thinking of suffering as, you know, part of how we worship, essentially. Like, I don't know if that's the right way of saying it. But approaching our suffering with the same gratitude of joy, you know, and getting to a space where it's all about presence to God, and whatever that suffering is, it allows us to just be more present. Yeah, I just think it's cool.
You know what's interesting, William, as you're saying this, remember when Richard Rohr was talking about necessary suffering? It is a necessary suffering that we need to go through, because it's through the difficulties of life that we actually grow. And it's the difficulties of life that are actually the part that is the descent in us. When we go through the difficulties, it strips us away of a lot of our illusions, strips us away of a lot of our creature comforts, and kind of pulls back the curtain. And I remember you had a hard time with that back then. In fact, I think we spent the better part of a whole session. We can call up the recording here, buddy.
That was the Arizona crew, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, Brady was in on it too. But I thought I remembered you. This is great, though. I mean, either way, but I was thinking maybe there was a little evolution in your thinking here from a few
Oh,
months ago.
I can see that. Yeah, why not? Hmm.
But I'm right with you. I mean, it is a great thought that, and maybe Viktor Frankl can help us out here. The great father of psychology and a Jewish psychologist during World War II, who survived Auschwitz and survived the death camps. His whole family did not, but he did. But afterwards, he wrote in his Man's Search for Meaning was the name of the book he wrote. And he was talking about this idea that it is in meaning that we are fulfilled as humankind. And the whole idea was that if you could find purpose in the pain, in the suffering, if you could find meaning in the pain, then it was overcomable. He said those who got through the death camps, those who lived and survived and kept their sanity about them, and were still able to be relational people on the other side of it, were those who found that meaning in even what they were suffering and the absolute absurdity of what was going on in those camps, and their ability to retain themselves and to continue to help each other. That finding of meaning in the suffering, I think, is where suffering and joy become synonymous, because it's God's presence ultimately that brings the meaning. So if we've got the meaning in God's presence, and if we are leaning into God's presence and are aware that God is present equally in the suffering or the joy, whatever it is that we happen to be experiencing at the moment, or whatever the circumstances have to be, that God's presence is equal and indiscriminate and always there, then I think more and more we can key into that, the meaning of that presence, rather than to our preferences of what it is we're experiencing at the moment, if that made any sense. But this is going to be a lot easier said than done. And as Ellen and Brother Lawrence are saying, yeah, maybe we're not all going to be able to experience this to the equal degree, but just working on it. There's value in just working on it. And we will get closer the more we practice the presence. So not to worry about who you are and who you think you're going to be able to be like, just get on the journey. See where it goes. Kind of like that. All right. Anything else?
And I think we can be absolutely, like he's saying in that sentence, we can be present to the enjoyable things in life. Absolutely. Right. And, experience, I think you've talked about this idea of gratitude being a form of worship itself, right? So we can have our gratitude and our suffering both be two arms of that same worship. And just roll with it.
What we talked about, and just right along those lines, what we talked about is when you are truly present, when you are completely immersed in the moment, the experience of that presence is gratitude. Because when you're really in the moment, then the moment is enough for you, and it doesn't need anything else to be more perfect. There's nothing to be taken away. You don't need to be anywhere else. You're just there, you're present, and it's totally a complete statement. And the experience of that presence is gratitude. So gratitude is the experience of what I think Jesus would call worship in spirit and truth, right? It is that experience. It is the feeling of that complete presence, which is worship. So it all kind of comes together. It's all of a piece. It's all one thing. And so if you were that immersed in your moments, if you're not afraid when a moment is difficult, when a moment is painful, normally when something's painful, like putting your hand on a hot stove, you're going to jerk it away, right? When we feel a difficult or painful moment, we want to jerk away. We want to exit it. We want to get away from the pain. But that's the exact opposite direction of where our healing actually lies. Because our healing is always in the moment, God's presence. if we can learn to still be present even to the moments that are difficult, then we're going to find the healing, we're going to find the meaning through the pain. And then I think more and more the suffering and the joy just become an experience of God's presence if we're always leaning in. And that's what Brother Lawrence is trying to get across.
I think it's easier to say, to us, to have that. I think it's a matter of faith also to say, oh, these are my moments of joy. Oh, see, thank you, God, you're here. Oh, thank you for watching over me, my daughters. Okay. But it's in the pain and suffering that I have to repeat to myself, I know you're here because they say you're here. I cannot feel you, but I know you're here. You're watching me, but I don't feel you. And I just have to be honest and say that. So that's where sometimes I'm at.
And maybe jumping off of that, usually when we're experiencing a painful moment, when we are suffering, we assume that means that God is either not present in that moment, or God has withheld his presence from us in that moment. There's something wrong with the moment because it's painful. And then our prayer normally is, take this moment away from me, right? Take this pain away from me. And as soon as we're doing that, then we're negating our ability to be present to God in that moment, because now we're seeing ourselves objectively somewhere far away and asking God to come back in rather than leaning in and finding that presence. And so I don't know if all of this is making this any clearer, any better, or if it's just muddying the waters, but this is a really deep subject and that William grabbed onto in that last line that we read. And hopefully it'll at least come clearer as we read more and more about Brother Lawrence and about his whole process and everything that goes behind what he experienced.
For me, what I have been learning along this journey, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I was reading some while I was away in Seattle, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be good. When I am suffering, it's not like I need to use my mind to come out of my suffering. I just need to surrender to the suffering. And I have to have the faith that God is there with me. I don't feel it at the time, and I am hurting and in pain, but I'm learning that it's not about what I think. I'm not relying on my thoughts and how I'm thinking to get through this suffering. I'm just surrendering to it and just saying, okay, here we go. Just go with the flow. And so I'm not really, and over the years, I'm starting to realize that he's with me. I understand it subconsciously because I know that through these other experiences and from reading through other people who have gone through and the mystics and all of this, I think I'm starting to trust, I guess, the process, and trust the pain and trust the suffering rather than trying to make the suffering go away or to fix the suffering in my head, or to say, like I know many, growing up Catholic, suffering was kind of like, oh, you have to, you have to inflict this suffering on yourself so you can suffer. But I'm realizing it's just not something you do. It's something you experience, and you have to let that just go. You just have to go with the experience and trust that, okay, wow, this is pretty painful. Whoa. And that's it. Sometimes there's not words, and no thoughts, or just, it's a journey. And I think just having the stories of others that have gone there before helps, so you can go through that journey and go with the flow, I guess, a little easier. And I think having a community, it just, I don't know much about Brother Lawrence, but I'm hoping he had others around him. I mean, which I don't know if he had, because I mean, some of these, monasteries were very like ritual and tradition. Had your prayer times and your times. I just wonder if he had a community of people that shared that same thought process. The little bit I did read, I was reading about this movement of quietism. I don't know if it was Henry Nouwen or someone that was talking about that, and how I'm wondering who in his life had influenced his way of thinking, that surrendered, in that just walking with God at all times. I'm interested in hearing who influenced that in his life, or how this all came about.
Mhm. And there's no evidence that he was studying other teachers or mystics. The kind of implication is that he fell on this on his own,
Yeah.
in just in the monastery and just experiencing what he experienced.
Mm.
Part of the introduction that I was not going to read, but just went into the publication of the book, gets into what you're talking about, Rosemary, because this Quietism was a movement in the 17th century in Europe, started by a Spanish priest. And then some of you maybe know Madame Guyon, who was a French woman, who also was a student of Molinos, who was the French priest. And together they kind of developed this way of coming at God that ended up being called Quietism. But it was denounced as a heresy within the church. And so when Brother Lawrence's writings were published, they were kind of, it was seen as a form of Quietism and was tarred and feathered with the same brush, just guilt by association, right?
Yeah.
And so it really was not accepted in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic circles, for a long time, and is just now kind of coming back around. But there are distinctions between what Brother Lawrence is doing and Quietism. And I don't know that it's important to get into that. We can if you want to, but for right now, we'll kind of move forward. But what you're saying, I think, Rosemary, is perfect. If you really think about it, all our thoughts do is separate things. That's what our thoughts are designed to do. That's what our conscious mind is designed to do as a survival tool. Our thoughts separate, it categorizes things, it defines things, it puts them in separate pigeonholes for fast retrieval and reference. What's a friend? What's a foe? What's poisonous? What's nurturing? All these things, but it's all to separate, define, and create this subject-object kind of relationship.
Right.
And so it's the same thing when we get into a difficult time or suffering, and that's what I'm hearing from you, Rosemary, is that as soon as you start thinking about it, or you think you're going to use your mind to get through it, you're really separating yourself once again from the only source of healing, which is God's presence in the moment that we can only access when we stop thinking. To be aware of something without thinking about it, to be aware without thinking about it, that is what Brother Lawrence is doing in the kitchen and throughout his day. He's aware, but he's not thinking about it. He's not separating himself from it.
Yeah.
Now, yes, he talks about having a constant conversation with God. Was that really in words? Did it start in words? Did it move into silence? I don't know. But, he had his way of staying connected in that way. But the more we use thought, the more we are separating ourselves from our moments and from everything that shares our moments with us. And that's what we're trying to do, is to become completely immersed in it. Now, does that mean that we don't think? Of course not. We got to be able to do that. But we want to balance it with this more mindful, conscious contact. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Dave, I wanted to say something about kind of like the other side of practicing the presence of God with physical pain, not emotional pain. And something that I started experiencing about 2 months ago or so, when I was speaking to Scott, when I was kind of at my limit in terms of the amount of pain, and my pain threshold was just so high. And I had always stated that halfway or some part of that conversation, the pain subsided. And it basically has stayed pain-free for these last months. And what I was noticing was that because of the pain level, I didn't have a presence of God. It was very, very hard. I was trying to deal with day to day and being able to get out of bed or whatever. But after this conversation with Scott, I've been focusing so much on making sure that I stop at least and get that presence of God. And when I do that, I can make the pain go away. Or I don't make it go away, but Rosemary, you said surrendering. I don't feel a surrendering. I just feel that I've connected. And when I connect, there isn't any pain. There's nothing other than that relationship.
Potato, huh?
You got it.
I mean, what are we going to call this thing? But it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Whatever we call this thing, that is the process of it that you're describing, Tony, that you're describing, Rosemary. You know, that ability to just move through it, to continue to lean in, to be present too, and then just see what happens. And then we really are making our circumstances less and less important to the overall experience that we're having as we live our lives. And I think that's also part and parcel to what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
For us, Dave, it's pretty exciting actually as we go into Brother Lawrence, because we've been actually rereading a book by Frank Labat. I don't know if you're familiar with that name, Frank Labat, I think, but it's called Modern Mystics. And he pretty much, like Brother Lawrence, has been trying to achieve the same thing in terms of practicing the presence of God. So in his letter writing as well, you see the honesty of what he's going through coming out in his letters. And just like Brother Lawrence was saying, that it's something that everybody may not attain to. You know, in one of his letters, Frank Labat, because he considers them to be experiment. You know, he's experimenting to figure out what are the different things I need to do to be constantly in God's presence. And he's truthful about the experience that he's encountering, you know, and he tells you, you know, in failing, you know, you get up and you go again. And it's been quite interesting when you started to talk about Brother Lawrence, to hear some of the things that Frank Labat was sharing as well in his experience, in terms of all he wished is an experiment that everybody would desire to do, but you know, everybody's not going to be able to do it, you know, and the joy that comes from those moments when he actually attains maybe an hour, 2 hours, even 30 minutes in the presence of God. And again, it's all about the thought process. You know, our thoughts tend mostly to take us away from the presence. And I like what you were saying in terms of us being Western, you know, the education. There's so much things that we have in our brain that we can so easily get distracted, that we ourselves take ourselves assumingly away from the presence of God. I mean, he's always there, but our thoughts alone take us completely different places. So being here tonight, and like Rosemary was saying, you know, one of Brother Lawrence had a community because for us being right now in the community, to hear from others and to be able to work this through, you know, is really enlightening, and for us very empowering.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because what you'll find, the more reading you do about readings from mystics, and Brother Lawrence can be put in that category, is that they're saying the same thing over and over again, but they're using all these different words, you know, potato to potato, just like we were talking about. You know, Tony is trying to express it one way, Rosemary is expressing it a different way, Frank Labat's expressing it another way, and Brother Lawrence, and so on and so forth. But it's the same experience. And you're going to see that as you start to understand what's going on, you'll read through the various ways that people express this experience and see that it's the same over and over again. And you'll hear a lot of the same things, of course, as well. And I suppose the other thing that we should bring up, even if we're not all able to attain to what Brother Lawrence did, that doesn't make us any less. It doesn't make us loved any less. It's just we're going to have a different experience of it. We're also not living in Brother Lawrence's world. You know, if Brother Lawrence was living in our world, would he be able to cut through the level of noise and distraction that we are experiencing? I don't know. You know, it's impossible to say, because he experienced and expressed what he lived in his own context. We're in all our own contexts.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be different. That's beautiful. That's fine. It doesn't matter. We're not trying to become Brother Lawrence. We're trying to follow the same path and see who we are on that path. And whatever we attain to is just perfect in that moment, if we let it be. So don't feel that there's any kind of a caste system here, that Brother Lawrence is at the top and we're trying to climb up. No, it's not like that. We're just showing up to our moments and seeing what happens. And that's going to be the beauty of it. Tell you what, let's take these next few minutes. Let's read the foreword and see what Henry Nouwen may have to offer. So this is actually going to be Roman numeral 9. It doesn't actually have a number, but just find the foreword there. Y'all there? Okay. Forward. In the midst of a society marked by fragmentation and alienation, Brother Lawrence's life and thoughts offer a real source of healing. Every time I pick up this little book and let its words come close to me, I realize that what this simple brother who lived in the 17th century had to say to the people who visited him and wrote to him has only gained in importance during the centuries after his death. Our lives are fragmented. There are so many things to do, so many events to worry about, so many people to think of, so many experiences to work through, so many tasks to fulfill, so many demands to respond to, and so many needs to pay attention to. Often it seems that just keeping things together asks for enormous energy. Different powers pull us into different directions, and our sense of unity and togetherness is constantly threatened. This fragmentation is probably one of the most painful experiences of modern men and women. Students and teachers, doctors and lawyers, scholars and business people, yes, even ministers and priests, all complain that life has become so busy that it is hard to keep the pieces together. Underneath the running and rushing of modern life often lurks the nagging feeling of being disconnected, alienated, and bored. Although we are busy, we experience ourselves as the passive victims of great powers that control us and seem very hard to resist. Life seems like a long series of randomly scattered incidents and accidents over which we have no control, no direction, no goals, no unity, no sense of meaning. And so while we are busy, we feel an inner emptiness. And while we hardly know how to keep up with the many things asking for our attention, we feel bored. It is to this condition of fragmentation and alienation that Brother Lawrence speaks when he presents us with the practice of the presence of God. When I was exposed to his thoughts for the first time, they seemed simple, even somewhat naive and unrealistic. But the deeper I entered into them and the longer I reflected on them, the more I became aware that Brother Lawrence's advice to walk constantly in the presence of God is not just a nice idea for a 17th century monk, but a most important challenge to our present day life situation. For Brother Lawrence, to live in the presence of God was his only concern. In the presence of God, life became very simple for him. This simpleness of life, however, was the result of a long struggle. Brother Lawrence leaves little doubt that the simple is very difficult, that to be free for God asks for discipline, and that the presence of the practice of the presence of God asks for the determination to let go from many daily worries. He writes, having found different methods of going to God and different practices to attain the spiritual life in several books, I decided that they would serve more to hinder than to facilitate me in what I was seeking, which was nothing other than a means to be wholly God's. This made me decide to give all to gain all. So after having given all to God in satisfaction for my sins, I began to live as if there were no one in the world but him and me. The great mystery of prayer, as the life of Brother Lawrence shows, is that this single-minded concern for God does not lead us away from people, but to the contrary, closer to them. Brother Lawrence's life shows clearly his great openness for his fellow human beings. He reminds us in a forceful way that we cannot find God in people, but that it is in God in us who finds God in people. When we are concerned with God and God alone, then we discover that the God of our prayer is the God of our neighbor. Therefore, the closer we come to God, the closer we come to each other. When we look at the world as a great wagon wheel of which we are the spokes and God is the hub, it becomes clear that our first task is to remain anchored in the hub. There in the center, we find ourselves most closely connected with each other. From that center in which we are all rooted in the force comes forth that makes the wheel turn. Brother Lawrence lived this knowledge and gave it very concrete form in his daily life. One of the most stimulating aspects of this precious book is Brother Lawrence's deep conviction that prayer is not saying prayers, but a way of living in which we all do become prayer. We indeed are called not just to say prayers, but to live a prayerful life. A prayerful life is a life in which we all do, eating and drinking, working and resting, playing and praying. I said that wrong. A prayerful life is a life in which all we do, eating and drinking, working and resting, playing and praying, is done to the glory of God and God alone. Prayers can often help us very much to lead a prayerful life, but that is only a part of it. For Brother Lawrence, the practice of the presence of God was not a practice for a few moments a day, not even for a few hours a day. No, for him, it was a practice that permeated every moment of his day. He felt that his work in the kitchen and his occasional trips were in no way less prayer than his hours in the church. Through the practice of the presence of God, nothing, absolutely nothing, was outside his intimate relationship with God. That is how he could experience an ongoing sense of joy and a real sense of communion. Brother Lawrence indeed lived a life of connectedness, which is the opposite of alienation, and a life of unity, which is the opposite of fragmentation. This simple but difficult way of Brother Lawrence is indeed a great challenge for us today. It is a hard way, but a way worth following. It is the way to God. Henry J. M. Nouwen. So I think the more that we're going to be reading, the more we're going to simply be reinforcing, these principles and getting a clearer and clearer look at who Brother Lawrence was, but then hopefully also being able to apply it to ourselves.
Mhm.
How does Brother Lawrence's experience, how does Brother Lawrence's method and way apply to us here in our world? Not 17th century France, but 21st century,
Mhm.
America, Caribbean, Chile, wherever we happen to be, right? How does it apply? What is the context into which we're going to pour this content that Brother Lawrence is giving us and let it fill up the shape of our container? Not trying to recreate Brother Lawrence's container, but to pour his content into our container and let it fill in all the nooks and crannies. That's going to be the real key. So as we read more of this, as we get closer to understanding what he's all about, how does that apply? How can we apply this? How can we start to practice the presence of God in our daily lives, as crowded and crazy as they may be? That's going to be the real key here, and the reason that we're undertaking this study in the first place. Any comments on the foreword, what Henry Nouwen had to offer?
I think now I understand why like monasteries and cloisters are very Spartan living conditions, because then like for me, I have the creature comforts, I have the heater, or I have the air conditioner. I think if you don't have too much of the creature comforts, I think I don't know, I think it's easier to get closer to God. Like in Brother Lawrence's case, I don't know, France rural area, but it's that simple life. But the distractions we have, the iPhone, the movies, all that takes away from that practicing of presence. And it reminds me of this podcast because I listened to your podcast, which is actually your Sunday message, right? This goes back 5 years ago. Thin Disguise, and I saved it as one of my favorites, where you said, yes, it's everywhere. I just don't recognize it. But God is everywhere. It's in disguise. So I have to keep reminding me of this.
Mhm.
And then it also reminded me, and you know, for William, you were talking about suffering and joy. There was another sermon you had about great leaders in times of crisis. They were the ones who had mental illness, depression, like Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill. In times of crisis, they were able to meet it because they had suffered before. They knew the coping skills. Whereas those who are healthy, balanced in times of crisis, they didn't rise up to the occasion because they didn't feel maybe pain and suffering. I think that's what it means when we learn from our suffering. We cope. And then, yeah, you mentioned like George Bush, and but yeah, those are all great lessons. It's now coming together, congealing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the 4 S's:
Mhm.
silence, solitude, stillness, and simplicity. And simplicity, of course, is really important. And not that we need to, tear out our air conditioners. You can keep your air conditioner; it's okay. But to learn to step away from it interiorly, not to make it such an important part of your life, not to identify with. Of course, it's kind of hard to identify with an air conditioner, but certainly with your resources, with your talents, with your accomplishments. Those are things we really do identify with. But as we start to simplify, we find those things are falling off. They're becoming less important, less integral, less a part of who we think we are. And they're more part of our surroundings now, more part of our circumstances that are becoming interchangeable, because the thread that runs through it all is God's presence. You see the difference? That's where the simplicity comes in. Not that we literally need to sell everything that we have and give it away, but that we need to step away from it interiorly, not engage it as part of our identity. That's the difference. And if we can start doing that, yeah, you almost can kind of have your cake and eat it too, I suppose, to a certain degree.
Mhm.
But you will find that you will be starting to give things away. You will find that you will be able to do more with less. And that'll just be a natural occurrence that'll take place as they move into the circumstances, move more into the background.
Dave, one of the things that I read this forward yesterday, and I'm a highlighter. I like to put highlights in my books, and so I can refer to stuff. But in the bottom paragraph on page 3 in the forward, really jumped out at me when it said that one of the most stimulating aspects of this precious book is Brother Lawrence's deep conviction that prayer is not saying prayers, but a way of living in which all we do becomes prayer. And that to me is, it speaks to behavior modification essentially, and it redirects us in our daily lives and activities. And the kinds of things that I've begun doing, and it just says it, in such an eloquent way.
Mm-hmm.
I just love that so much.
Absolutely. And that calls to mind Francis of Assisi, right? Preach the gospel continuously, use words where necessary. I mean, this same idea over and over again, that what we do, worshiping in spirit and truth, our whole lives become the act of worship, the act of prayer. Paul saying pray continuously. He's not talking about continuous stream of words, but he's talking about a continuous practice of presence, awareness of presence, a connection. That's what we're getting at. So yes, you're absolutely on it, John. And the paragraph right before was really striking to me as well, because this also brings to mind what Thomas Merton was talking about. He went to the monastery to remove himself from the world so that he could find his holiness and find his connection with God, only to realize that even in the cloister of the monastery, what it was doing was actually drawing him closer together with all the peoples of the world, which led to his famous, experience at Fourth and Walnut, where he loved all those people, right? But here's the way that Henry Nouwen says it about Brother Lawrence. The great mystery of prayer, as the life of Brother Lawrence shows, is that this single-minded concern for God does not lead us away from people, but to the contrary, closer to them. Brother Lawrence's life shows clearly that his great openness for his fellow human beings. He reminds us in a forceful way that we cannot find God in people, but that it is God in us who finds God in people. When we are concerned with God and God alone, we discover that the God of our prayer is the God of our neighbor. Therefore, the closer we come to God, the closer we come to each other. This is all of a piece. I've said many times that we don't love God directly. I mean, how do you do that? Do you do that in your spoken prayers? Do you do that when you go to church on Sunday? Is that loving God directly? I think what Jesus would say is that we love God by loving our neighbor. It's in all of these relationships and everything we do all day long that we are loving God. And as we love God, we're loving our neighbor, vice versa, and everything comes together in that unity. And so even as we go into our prayer closets, even as we are becoming more aware of God's presence interiorly, that is also drawing us closer in all of our relationships at the same time. You can't do one without the other. And I think that's an important point for us to make as well. All right. I think that's as far as we're going to get tonight. We actually
Dave, I really like that line right before that paragraph you just read there. I began to live as if there is no one in the world but him and me. Like that idea of, that says it all right there.
It sort of does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I often ask people when I'm in session with them in a counseling session, who's the most important person in your life right now? And they'll think and they'll go through the laundry list of their kids or their husband, their wife, their this or that, or sometimes they'll say myself. I said, but who's the most important person in your life right now? And the answer, of course, I'm looking for is me, because it's all about me, right? But if we're alone in a room together, the most important person in my life right now is you. Has to be, because if I'm sitting alone in a room with a closed door and I'm thinking about my wife, well, I'm not with her and I'm certainly not with you, So to start to live your life as if the only one present is you and God, you and the person you're with, and whoever that happens to be as the faces change and rotate, but whoever is right in your path is the most important person in your life. How would you experience your moments? How would that change the experience of your life? Gosh, that is so amazingly profound. And yet, how often do we really pull that off? But the more we practice it, the more we can have that kind of intensity of experience. This is the most important moment of my life, no matter how insignificant it may seem on paper, because it's the one I'm experiencing now. And whoever and whatever shares it with me is the most important person and the most important things in my life right now. And the thread that holds all that together is always God's presence at the root of it all. So it's a very different way of approaching life than we normally do. And that's the whole point. Okie doke. Time to stop. Well, this was a great kickoff to the book. We'll get into the introduction next week, and we'll see how far we get there. We probably won't finish the introduction next week because it's kind of a long one, even though we're not going to do it all. And then we'll get into the book. But be thinking about things, and if you have any questions, or if you do read ahead as John did, overachiever John, if you decide to do that, highlight things, make notes, bring those questions and thoughts into the session here, because if it was significant to you, or if it created a question in your mind, I guarantee you it's going to be significant and bring up questions in the minds of others. And so that's where we want to bring these things, and we want to air them out here for everyone to be able to be a part of that. So please, yeah, make notes and think about things and bring them into the sessions here. All right. All right, where is he? Scott.
Father God, we're just so grateful that you're here. Wherever we are, whatever we're walking through, whatever we're going through, and whatever we experience, you're here. And that's enough. So we seek to know you better, deeper, and more thoroughly and completely, and be in an extremely intimate relationship with you, Father. Thank you that you desire such relationship with us. It's in your holy and precious name, Lord Jesus, that we give our thanks and say our amens. Amen.
Amen. Okay, everybody. So I will be taking this recording and emailing it to you and the link to it and the new playlist. So if you don't get that tomorrow, make sure that you either text me or call me and let me know, and I'll make sure that you're on the list and I've got the updated email address and all that, because you should be getting those on a weekly basis. Okie doke.
No.
All right. See you all on Sunday. One way or another.
Good
hopefully.
night, guys.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, William.
Good night, Chris. Good night, Anya, Jordana, Linda. Okay.
You guys.
And yes,
Ciao.
Vaughn, all the way down there under. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Linda, were
See
you
you
able
soon.
to see anybody?
Now, I
Okay.
think John didn't punch something that he did the last time, and I gotta remind him. Does that make sense?
No, it really doesn't, because I mean, the only thing that I mean, if you're not, we're seeing you, so everything is on. Your mic is on, your camera's on. So if you're not seeing us, then you probably clicked something that changed the view, or actually took the whole window away.
Oh, man. So what do I do?
I have
Can
no
I-
idea. I have no
Okay.
idea, because I'm not in front of your screen, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's gonna be,
I would say when John first set you up today, could you see?
no,
You never could?
no, but I can right now.
Yes, you can see, because of the fact that in a recorded message, it says, this is being recorded, you got it or not, was sitting up in front of her screen, because it pops up a message about the fact that this is being recorded.